A typical teenager named Stanley Yelnats has spent his whole life getting into all sorts of troublesome situations. According to his grandfather, Stanley Yelnats II, their family has been under a century-and-a-half-old curse that affects only the men. And once again, poor Stanley finds himself in a new predicament. The police accuse him of stealing a pair of sneakers, which he, of course, didn't take, and a court sentence sends him to an 18-month labor camp with the picturesque name of Green Lake. But Stanley's expectations are quickly dashed. Instead of a lake, he is met with a bleak, desert-like landscape, the ground pocked with shallow holes. First, a guard brings the new inmate to the administration building, where he introduces him to the head supervisor, Marion Savillo. The boy, still not fully grasping where he has ended up, chatters amiably about the unusual family tradition of naming all boys Stanley Yelnats, a palindrome, readable the same forwards and backwards. The supervisor merely smirks and orders that he henceforth be called only Mr. Sir. Then the man takes the boy outside. Stanley sees no watchtowers or barbed wire, but if he tries to escape, a painful death awaits. For miles around, the camp stretches a scorching, waterless desert, with vultures ready to feast on any lost wanderer. Next, Marion leads him to the supply room, where he is issued 2 sets of clothes. The supervisor explains that he will be required to dig 1 hole a day, 1.5 meters deep and just as wide, while avoiding various crawling creatures. A rattlesnake bite is survivable, but yellow-spotted lizards are deadly. After intimidating the boy sufficiently, Marion turns him over to his assistant, Dr. Pendansky, the camp's counselor. Pendansky assigns him to the Virtue Group and gives him a mini tour of the surroundings, pointing out what is where. Indicating a certain house, the doctor warns that the first and most important rule is not to anger the supervisor, Miss Walker. Near the communal tent, Stanley meets Alan, Rex, and Theodore, who are extremely sensitive about their real names. Later, Theodore, nicknamed Armpit, even knocks Stanley to the ground, making it clear that everyone here has a nickname, and using real names is forbidden. At lunch, in the mess hall, Rex, nicknamed X-Ray, takes bread from the newcomer, and everyone laughs when they learn that Stanley ended up here for stealing a pair of sneakers. Famous baseball player Clyde Livingston had donated the shoes to an orphanage and even testified against Stanley in court, outraged that the little brat had robbed helpless orphans. The quiet boy Zero suddenly perked up and spoke when he heard the name of the famous athlete and mention of the orphanage, surprising everyone present. That night, Stanley had trouble falling asleep. He remembered how his grandfather had told him about his great-great-grandfather, Stanley Yelnats I. He had made a fortune on the stock market, which was later stolen from him by the outlaw Catherine Barlow, nicknamed Kissin' Kate. The nickname came from the fact that she kissed everyone she killed. Stanley I had once spent 16 days alone in the desert without food or water. The laborers were awakened while it was still dark and given shovels. After a meager breakfast, the boys were taken out to the desert, where each group was assigned a section and began their daily routine. Marion personally showed Stanley where he was to dig and promised that if he found anything interesting, he could rest for the remainder of the workday. Stanley asked what exactly he was supposed to find, and the supervisor replied, "Nothing." Digging was a form of labor therapy meant to reform criminals into normal people. The narrative returns to the past, explaining why the Yelnats family was cursed. According to Stanley's grandfather, their misfortunes stemmed from the foolish romanticism of his great-great-great-grandfather, Elia Yelnats. While cleaning a cowshed in a small Latvian village, he fell hopelessly in love with the landlord's daughter, Myra. To win her heart, Elia sought the advice of a fortune teller, Madame Zeroni, who gladly helped him but in return asked for a favor. However, Elia abandoned the plan, forgot about Madame Zeroni, and left the country. After which, his family was struck by a powerful curse. By evening, after digging his first hole, Stanley IV returned to camp and nearly fell victim to a yellow-spotted lizard. Fortunately, the supervisor arrived in time and shot the aggressive reptile. The monotonous, nearly identical days at the camp dragged on unbearably. Between digging holes and interacting with the other boys, Stanley began writing letters home, telling his family about his experiences and sharing his dreams for the future. One day, he found a fossil. Proudly, he handed it to Dr. Pendanski, hoping for a day off. But the counselor disappointed him, stating that the supervisor didn't care about fossils. Disappointed, Stanley then asks Pendanski if it's true that there used to be a lake here, to which the man replies that not only was there a lake, but also a town once owned by the head supervisor's grandfather. Later, during free time, Stanley is pushed and falls onto a wild-tempered boy. X-Ray manages to smooth over the conflict, and Stanley learns that he has been given the nickname Caveman, which makes him quite happy. After dinner, the counselor holds a corrective talk with the boys. Pendanski tells Stanley directly that he has already ruined his life, but here he has a chance to set things right. Attention then shifts to the quiet Zero, and Armpit notices that he only acknowledges Caveman, ignoring everyone else. The next day, Zero interrupts Stanley while he is reading a new letter and tries to befriend him, asking Stanley to teach him to read. But Stanley, citing fatigue, leaves the tent, leaving a disappointed Zero behind, who refuses to join the other boys in their games outside. After some time, Stanley finds something in the dirt again. This time, it is an old bullet casing engraved with KB. X-Ray immediately claims the find for himself, which angers Caveman. Stanley wisely avoids arguing, and the next morning, X-Ray ceremoniously hands the casing to Pendanski. The counselor calls in the camp supervisor, Miss Walker, who, after inspecting the item, orders that X-Ray be excused from work, given a shower token, and provided with food. The rest of the boys are commanded to deepen X-Ray's hole and dig over their entire section. The narrative then returns to the past, to the town that once stood on this site. A black man named Sam falls in love with the schoolteacher Catherine. Driven by his feelings, he helps repair her roof and renovate the school, asking only a symbolic payment of 3 cans of peaches. Gradually, Catherine also falls in love with him, rejecting the affections of the town leader, Trout Walker. Out of spite, Walker burns down the school, and the local sheriff decrees that Sam should be executed for daring to touch a white woman. Heartbroken by the loss of her love, Catherine begins her revenge, becoming the outlaw Kissin' Kate. For 4 long days, the boys tirelessly dig the earth, but find nothing of value. They are then assigned to dig separate holes again. One day, as Marion distributes water to the boys, the boy nicknamed Magnet steals some sunflower seeds from his cart. However, the boys do not get long to enjoy their snack. The supervisor quickly noticed the missing seeds and went back to retrieve them. But Stanley decided to take the blame. In anger, Marion shoved him into a pickup truck and drove him to the camp to complain to the head supervisor. Strangely, she hit Stanley, but then let him go. Before that, he had glimpsed newspaper clippings about the infamous outlaw Kate Barlow decorating the walls of her house. When Caveman returned to his hole, he found that Zero had helped him and dug the entire thing for him. Touched by this gesture, Stanley promises to teach Zero how to read and write. That evening, during dinner, the boys notice Marion's scratched and swollen face, and he aggressively reacts to any comment about it. The next morning, Marion vents his anger on Stanley by pouring out his daily ration of water onto the ground. Later, Stanley reflects on what he saw in Miss Walker's office and realizes that their digging is somehow connected to the elusive Kate Barlow, who once terrorized the prairies with raids on canisters and trains. As promised, Stanley begins teaching Zero to read and write, and Zero, in turn, helps him dig his hole. During breaks, Zero opens up to Stanley and reveals his real name, Hector Zeroni. He tells how he and his mother frequently moved from place to place, and then she disappeared. Hector waited for her in the park and even slept in a ditch, but she never returned. The other boys begin to notice that Caveman, thanks to Zero's help, works less than the others. Taking advantage of the moment, a boy nicknamed Zigzag tries to attack him to teach him a lesson. Unexpectedly, Zero stands up for his friend and bravely jumps into the fight. Pendanski stops the fight with a shot into the air and calls in the authorities. Miss Walker and Marion scold Zigzag, but the other boys support him. Zigzag argues that Zero helps Caveman dig his hole, which is unfair. Stanley defends him, saying he's teaching Zero to read and write, and anyway, The hole is already dug. What difference does it make who did it? Miss Walker is displeased and forbids the boys from helping each other, insisting they must learn the lesson themselves. Pendanski mocks Zero, claiming he's only fit for digging. In response, Zero defiantly says he will dig no more, hits the counselor with a shovel, and runs off into the desert. Later, at a meeting, Marion confesses that the situation makes him uneasy, but Pendanski dismisses his concern, saying there's nothing to worry about. Zero is an orphan and has no one to defend him. He ended up at the camp for vagrancy, so clearly, no one cares about him. However, to prevent any interest from child welfare authorities, the head supervisor orders that all records of his time at Camp Green Lake be destroyed. At night, the boys couldn't sleep in the tent. Most of them teased Zero, making bets on how he might meet his end, while only Stanley genuinely worried about him. The next day, Stanley decided to steal Marion's pickup with a water tank, but ended up driving it into a hole, forcing him to flee across the desert on foot and without water. Meanwhile, Marion asks the head supervisor what to do, since Stanley has a family. Miss Walker replies that she will inform them of his escape in 2 weeks. After some time, Stanley finds Hector hiding from the scorching sun under an abandoned wagon. He urges him to return to camp, warning that they'll die out here, but Hector refuses and offers him some canned compote he found among old belongings. Suddenly, the boys notice a distant mountain shaped like a finger. Stanley immediately recalls the story of his great-great-grandfather, who survived 16 days in the desert. Legend says he reached safety by climbing to the top of God's thumb. The friends decide to do the same and head toward the mountain. During the climb, Stanley nearly slips, but Hector saves him, cutting his own hands in the process. Later, dehydrated and faint from the heat, Hector needs to be carried by Stanley. Soon they find a source of cool water and a patch of sweet onions growing nearby. After eating and drinking their fill, the friends spend the night on the mountain. In the morning, Hector confesses to Stanley that he is the reason Stanley ended up at the camp he stole the shoes at a charity auction, panicked when he heard sirens, and discarded them. The shoes eventually ended up with Stanley, while Hector got caught the next day for stealing boots. Stanley believes it was fate. 3 days later, Stanley's lawyer arrives at the camp demanding to see him, but Miss Walker chases her away, fearing that Stanley's absence would be discovered. Meanwhile, the boys have been living near the mountain's spring. At night, Stanley tells Hector again that he's glad he stole the shoes. Otherwise, Stanley would never have ended up at the camp. Sitting there and eating onions, Stanley feels a strange sense of well-being. Zero agrees, and suddenly notices a constellation shaped like a shovel. Sensing luck, Stanley suggests digging one more hole. Before dawn, the boys return to the desert, heading to the very hole where Stanley first found the bullet casing. They begin digging the hole wider, and soon uncover a chest. But they are suddenly caught by Miss Walker and Marion, and from the hole in the ground, several poisonous lizards crawl out and surround the boys. Walker explains that when the lake dried up, Kissing Kate Barlow buried her stolen treasure in this desert. The head supervisor's grandfather, Trout Walker, who owned the land, spent his whole life searching for the treasure and even made her dig holes from a young age. By now, it was already dawn, and the boys, trapped in the circle of lizards, were still not released from the hole. Surprisingly, the reptiles, for some reason, did not bite them. Suddenly, Miss Walker and her assistants notice approaching vehicles. It was Stanley Yelnats' lawyer and the police, whom she had called after the supervisor's harsh treatment. At the same time, Hector notices that the chest bears the name of Stanley's great-grandfather, meaning it now belongs to him. Returning to the camp, the lawyer asks Stanley to gather his belongings, but the boy insists he won't go anywhere without Hector. The police, finding no record of Hector in their database, warn Miss Walker that an investigation will be launched regarding the camp. One of the officers unexpectedly recognizes Marion as a former inmate, and Pendanski turns out not to be a real doctor. Walker desperately denies knowing anything, but the three are arrested. All the boys sincerely rejoice that Caveman and Zero are alive and say their goodbyes. Later, when Stanley returns home with Hector, his father opens the chest, revealing stocks, money, and jewels worth millions by today's standards. Half of it is decided to be given to Hector. With that money, he immediately hires private investigators, who locate his mother. Thus, the great-great-great-grandson of Elia Yelnats and the great-great-grandson of Madame Zeroni become neighbors, whose friendship finally lifts the family's long-standing curse. And here, even more stories await you. Subscribe.